aim on Saturday also.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the April 24th, 2024 meeting of the Audit Committee. I guess we can start with a little go around the room and introduce and say who you are, and then we'll get started. Do you want to start, Isaac?
I am Emma Mueller, and I'm also an internal audit supervisor. Good afternoon, everyone. Lauren Roberts, Chief Audit Executive.
Paul Kitzmiller, audit committee member, proud CPS parent.
Liz Guttridge, Audit Committee Vice Chair.
Seth Harmon, audit committee member.
Brandon Craig, board member.
Dr. Kareem Moffitt, board member.
Michael Guston, Assistant Treasurer.
Kevin Ashley, Director of Financial Reporting and Transparency.
And there we have, Yep.
Jim Crossett, Audit Committee Member.
great. So I think we've got some interesting and illuminating topics to discuss this afternoon. So I guess we'll just go ahead and start with the dashboard update.
Okay, I'm just gonna share my screen. There we go. So we are at our audit committee on April 24th, and we had a few areas of review. So we completed our school audit report that consisted of 3 different schools. It was in the email I think Lauren sent on Sunday night, and then it's also attached to our dashboard and in your packet. If you guys need any type of copy, you have it. We also have the materials from the March 15th Finance Committee meeting, specifically within our dashboard and in your packets as well. I think one area of interest would be a benefits update, so you can look at that. And if there are any questions or specifics, we can always ask benefits to come and present as well. The other areas of note that you might want to look at our upcoming dates. So our finance committee meetings, our financial town halls, and then our next audit committee meeting will be Wednesday, June 26th. One area to look at as well are our district external audits. So these are as of April 11th. With that being said, sometimes things can change between when we get the information plugged into our dashboard and when we present on it. But as of April 11th, we had 7 external audits that were in progress, and I think 6 of them were compliance audits. So we reach out to those folks a few weeks in advance to gather this information and then review it with them. And they keep us updated when a report is ready or when we get feedback from one of the external audits. So it's something we're going to keep doing going forward. And we're also hoping to kind of implement a district external audit form in the future for other areas within the district. That being said, I will pass it on to Lauren, and if we have time at the end, we'll go over things you like about the dashboard or maybe things you want to see next year. Yeah, great. Thanks, Emma. So I'll be covering the next section on the dashboard, so you can see it presented on the screen as well as in your packet. So really pleased to share that our fiscal 2024 internal audit plan is either complete or very near to complete as we approach the end of the fiscal year. So incredibly proud of this team for all the hard work that's gone into this project and these projects, I should say. So you can see our 73% completion is really something to celebrate, and we're quite happy. So to give a little more information about projects, I apologize if a bit of this could be redundant as I captured the status of each project in my evaluation, but for the sake of the public, wanted to provide some additional context so everyone can hear of the progress that's been made. So in terms of this first project, this is an advisory project focused on donations, crowdfunding, and fundraising. And so it's a very timely update as we met last night for our financial town hall, Just Ask Jen, and the focus was just this topic. So I was quite honored to be invited and to speak with our assistant treasurer, and 2 esteemed board members to talk through this topic. And really, as we approached the work this year, we wanted to break the project into 2 objectives. And the reason I dive into detail here is with advisory, we don't issue audit reports. So this is a bit of our update, our takeaways, and what we learned from it. So moving forward, the 2 objectives of this project were to assist and help ensure that management moved forward in presenting to the board and working with the board to pass a few policies. So those policies were an update to our gifts, grants, and bequests policy, or pardon me, gifts, donations, bequests. So that was updated effectively and passed by the board on March 18th.
And the second policy is the crowdsourcing policy that will be passed pending the board approval on April 28th. So that's the completion of our first objective. And the second objective is taking that a step further and serving as an advisor and a consultant to our management team as they break down and develop the administrative procedure behind that board policy. So we're pleased to share that the work of the treasurer's office was that they have developed a smart sheet tool. So a form very similar to the tools that we use here to gather that information consistently throughout the district and to help build upon giving people, our wonderful donors, a great opportunity to do just that. But the key here was streamlining, adding internal controls so that way our donors' intent is met and that funds actually go to exactly where they're supposed to go. So more information to come. I think that is still a work in progress, but I think from our perspective, we've concluded our advising on the area. Yeah, please.
So what is the
Yes. So I don't know, Mike, if you would want to speak to a little bit more, but not to put you on the spot. You did such a great job at the town hall.
Sure. So yeah, there is a new policy on donations. It really just kind of clarifies, I guess, some past practices. Big thing is process of receiving donations, making sure those are tracked, inventoried, officially accepted by the board over a certain threshold, and recording the treasurer's report, so on and so forth. So.
Absolutely. Thank you. Great question. And we did link up those policies. If you are really as excited about them as we are, you can hop in and take a look as well. But I will say that just as a final note, the crowdsourcing policy was something that originated from the Ohio Auditor of State Guidance through a bulletin a few years ago. So this is really our step in the right direction and following what the state auditor expects as well. Yeah. Anything more from our board members on the topic since we just spoke about last night?
I'll just say it's glad that we got the work done, because I think it also helps the folks who are out at our various schools do these things in the right way so that people feel comfortable donating things and know the right processes to do so. And that there's clarity around the sourcing crowdfunding, because I think that is another one. Those areas it gets a little tricky when folks are doing their own thing with like doing a GoFundMe or whatever that not in the way that we would necessarily want them to do or that we can track.
Yeah, thank you. So moving on to our next area of assurance projects. So that's twofold. The first of those projects is continuous auditing. And so just as a reminder, this project encompasses a limited scope testing of 4 areas. This year, we are looking at employee reimbursements, procurement card transactions, security badges, and overtime. So it's reminiscent of audits we've performed in the past, just selecting a limited portion of those tests to repeat on a quarterly basis. So this is very clearly representative of the 3 quarters we're testing this year. You can see through the field work, quarter 1 is complete, quarter 2 is in progress, and quarter 3 will occur next, with the goal of completing the work and reporting to you all at the June 26th meeting. And one item to note here is this has been a huge area of focus for our internal audit intern. And so that really shows the value that that team member has added to our team this year, because it allows us to perform this type of continuous work under the supervision of our internal audit supervisors, but allowing them more time to work on numerous projects at once. So the next area, this is a really great thing to see from our perspective. The school audit project is complete. You'll notice the number of tasks. I think we mentioned they start really little and then they get really big and the progress goes back and then finally it moves to the green. So you can see through the number of tasks that this was a pretty significant project. I think we spent about 600 audit hours on the work. But I think you'll learn today about what we did and we'll share more of that. So what's remaining there is just those final reporting steps. So the next 3 areas I think I can speak to concurrently. You may have seen this in my evaluation update, but essentially the risk analysis is broken into 2 projects, one focused on the organizational risk and the other on the IT risk, as well as our IIA compliance through the development of a manual and long-term preparation for an eventual peer review. So all three of these projects are moving well along with the goal and estimated completion date of reporting to you all at the June 26th meeting. And why it's on track for us is this work will feed into what our fiscal 2025 plan will look like. So the risk analysis is developing tools, developing that long-term approach. So these are all multi-year projects, and our plan will include year one, projected of what year 2 and 3 may look like. So that's really the deliverable, but one that will inform fiscal 25 as well. And then finally, the status of past recommendations. Again, you can see the amount of progress and what's remaining is representative of our one additional audit committee meeting in June. So this was rolled out, I believe, in October of this past year, and we've been providing those updates. So any questions before I hand it over to Isaac to dive into those status of past recommendations?
I did have a question back to the fundraising policies.
Yeah.
I was wondering where for-profit fundraising fits into, is that considered crowdfunding? Is that considered so you're giving me a look like you're not sure what I'm talking about. I'm
No.
talking about like Boosterthon is what they do at my kids' school. I'm sure there are other groups that are doing it as well. Does that fall under these policies, or is there sort of a different policy for
So
that?
most of the boosters in those type of groups are separate entities. So if they're raising funds, we did have a conversation about that yesterday as part of the town hall, but they are separate. I think Jen, since Jen's on the line, also might be a better person to speak exactly to it. So, but yeah, they're separate entities.
Sorry, good afternoon.
We hear you, Jen.
You can hear me? Okay,
Yes.
I couldn't turn my video on. So, yeah, so if they're a separate 501c3, that we would just want them to coordinate because they may be using, our name and likeness. And we want to make sure that whatever their effort is something it's for a proper public purpose for the district. But those monies stay in their hands. We don't receive that money. So it kind of sort of aligns with our policy because of using student and the district's logos and images and stuff like that during their fundraising. But it doesn't because they're separate 501c3s and they have their own bank accounts. Does that answer your question?
I think so. So because they're their own organization, I guess my concern is that I don't think there's really that it's clear to the people that they're soliciting donations from that they're not the
CPS.
school, or that they're like, I feel like there's no transparency around how much of the money is actually going back to the school and what percentage of that is going to these organizations. Which, and I just personally, I think their like practices are really not good when they come into the schools. I find it very upsetting, but they raise a lot of money. And so I think people just like, oh, well, let's just bring them in. But I really don't think that anybody knows what a large percentage of that money is not going to their school.
So we talked about that a lot last night as well. And so we've already started plans to create a transparent website. We already have information on our website, but Dr. Moffat came up with the idea to start posting the people who don't want to be anonymous, but posting so that people can look and see where their money's going and who's already contributed to this school or that project. So they make a different choice on what they might want to invest money in. When it comes to other entities, we don't really have any control over them because they're their own legal entity. The only relationship we have is when they're trying to act as if they're our stewards. And so that needs to be reported to us so that we can try to address it. But I don't disagree that there's not a lot of transparency right now, but we do have plans to try to be in terms of what we can control, what our transparency is.
So I'll just add, this is been a year-long process, recognizing that there, exactly what you shared is going on. This is the first phase of getting policy established in alignment with what the state is saying. Hey, there need to be some policies around this for everybody. And then, so they've spent a significant amount of time to both of those teams, hearing my mouth complain and hearing some other board members share that we see that exactly what you're saying, that these things are happening, but in practice, how is there any management of that? So the first phase is this, establishing policy that is in alignment with the state requirements for auditing, that Lauren's team can effectively manage and collect. Now we have to go out, because it is self-reporting, and say, hey, school, we know you have a foundation, or we think you have a foundation. Can you play nice in the sandbox? Get them to admit to us that they do, but there would be no, there's no accountability, except for the fact that we do have a policy that says, if you use our likeness and if you use those things, then we can impact some restrictions, but we don't know that yet. So we know it, but we don't have proof. So they are really, really trying to get to what you're saying, because we do have significant foundations that are raising significant amounts of money and contributing, and they're their own entity. So this took a year, I know at least, and they worked really super hard. So kudos to the team, but they're still working because there's more to do for sure.
So if these groups, when they say we've raised, X $1,000, that money is not necessarily going to the school, it's potentially going to a foundation.
So
or
what has happened, let me say what I've seen happen. The school foundation has thrown a walkathon or has done a significant fundraiser. And usually it's like $5,000 to $10,000 for a purpose, using the school's resources. So they've used the building, they've used the neighborhood, they've used the listserv, and most importantly, they've used the district logo to solicit that. That's where we would have some ability to impart some restrictions. They are raising it on behalf of the students, so they have control as to what that money gets spent on. The school doesn't, because it's raised under a 501c3 that they've registered and that they have their own bylaws for with the state of Ohio. So the parents are participating on behalf of their kids, but it's not the school per se that is raising that money. It is the foundation. And that's not illegal, but it's just, we need to hold hands.
Okay.
I think one thing also to help clarify is that if they then if they raise a certain amount of money and they intend to then use it towards, sending the kids to, a music camp or sending your kids to a theater program or whatever, that still has to be donated within the same way that anyone else would donate or provide funding to the district. And so one of the things that, and you see this a lot with some of the foundations that are a little bit more established, or some of the booster groups that are a little bit more established, is they may pay for a particular, like, oh, we're going to buy a new set of, stands or something, or we'll buy new uniforms or these type of things. That would still go through the process of donating. And so that's one of the ways we hope that, at least with these new policy, with things like the crowdfunding new policies and stuff, that we can get them to recognize and appreciate, if you're going to donate, for instance, even if it's the foundation, they can't donate with gift cards. Great example, right? So you can't crowdfund or drive donations to a 501c3 to then give gift cards to students in the school, using the resources of the district. And so there are things that they would have to do in order to be able to donate, and in order to be still compliant with what we would require and what we can accept. I think that's the real challenge, is getting folks to Dr. Moffitt's point, when things are given, to acknowledge that they were ever received, or that this was the method in which people paid for things. Because I know for a long time, especially field trips were a great example of where suddenly funds came in for somebody to pay for somebody's field trip that no one knows where those dollars might have come from. And but yes, it's still a challenge, because again, I think there's some real questions about how do you use the school district's name and image likeness, even with private entities using
Yeah.
our information.
Well, and at my kids' school, their staff comes into the school and they have access to the kids and they put a lot of social pressure on them to participate in these fundraisers. They give them very visible signs of who's participated and who's not. There's a lot of pressure. Somebody in my house cries every year. And I think it's terrible because the school's not saying, and the organization is not saying how much of that money they're keeping as their for-profit company and how much is actually going to the school. And I don't think the parents who are donating know. Like, I don't think anyone's, I'm hoping that, yeah, go ahead.
I was just wondering, Dr. Moffett, if you talked about phase one, but just hearing and listening about this suggestion or idea, phase two could be that none of these entities can come to the school or use the likeness unless they none of these entities, these 501c3s can participate, use this CPS logo and the school's name unless they meet certain requirements before they can even get in the door. I think that would be a place to put some control in to say, look, if you're going to be here, use our stuff. This is what you got to do. And some control point up front might be phase two.
I will say, Jen and Treasurer Wagner and Auditor Roberts have a plan for phase two. That's definitely my suggestion that it be included in that. But I will say what we ended with yesterday was that we want donations. We want the engagement with families. We don't want to turn anyone's money away by all means, but we just need to be in compliance with Ohio ethics and the auditor. And so that's really where this is coming from. And again, we have to kind of ask because we don't know unless you tell us. We don't know what fell. I can tell you some schools that I know have foundations, but again, that's kind of self-reporting, and that's the bad thing. Once we know, I think we will be able to do a lot. So they're constructing phase two and probably phase three, which has those consequences in there for now, for sure. But if you do know of any schools that have foundations, I've shared them with them, and it's really nice. They just want to make sure that nobody's going to jail. That's really what it is.
Quickly add, I think the reason this got to where it got, a big reason this got to where we got this year is when Mike came into his new role as assistant treasurer, he's like, okay, so we've been working on this how long? What do we need to do to get that next step? And honestly, the thing that's really hard about this is scope is enormous when you look at it all together. And so we finally, I remember when we were having our planning conversations, we were trying to define donations, fundraising, crowdsourcing, and those all mean different things. And so I think where we honed in was let's, for the time being, rule out the non-school organizations. Okay, so let's say when the dollars start to come to us, what do we do? And start by defining that really clearly. And then once we have our foundation, like not that foundation, but the base built, take that next step. Because that's been the challenge is it's what about this? And it's just the list goes on and on. So hopefully by breaking off pieces at a time, we can get there in the long run. Because I think those controls really will be effective.
All right. I apologize for derailing that discussion. So thank you everyone for.
You're in charge.
So Isaac, are we back to you then? Or? Okay, thanks.
This last piece is related to the status of past audit recommendation. The fifth update that we have received. Methodology. All of the areas continue to progress with implementing the recommendations that we have issued. Significant progress has been made since the February meeting. significant progress has been made since the February meeting. Incomplete recommendations have decreased from 72 to 57. So 15 recommendations have been marked as complete since February. A few areas that have been marked as complete for cash controls, a new district policy for district-wide or base student fees has been implemented that addresses 2 of the recommendations. Security badges has fully implemented 4 recommendations. The staff badging team has finalized and implemented a variety of new processes, reviews, and automated controls to address some of the gaps that we found in our audit. So moving forward onto the 6th update, which will be in June, internal audit is planning to meet with responsible members of management for that last update. And we're going to discuss with them all of the responses they've provided throughout the entire fiscal year. We're going to go through any issues that they have faced, such as reasons for pushing back their estimated implementation date. And then we're also going to ask for feedback around how we can improve this process of receiving updates from management and if there's anything we need to change for fiscal year 25. And then we're also going to try to capture any return on investment or any type of data improvements that we can. And we'll hopefully bring that back to the June meeting and to kind of close out the fiscal year 24 and then also as we plan for the fiscal year 25 work.
I have a question.
Yeah.
On some of these older recommendations, will part of your process include the opportunity to reevaluate whether the recommendation is still valid?
Yeah, certainly.
Okay.
I think that is even one of the questions that we ask every audit committee meeting. It says, is this recommendation still applicable? Like, does it still make sense? And so we ask that, and it's just a yes or no on there, but we'll definitely revisit that. And I think a lot of them are captured in the management updates as to why. I know for P card, we recommended joining some type of fuel program, and that's just been a really large undertaking to kind of find something that fits with the district's needs and whatnot. And so that'll definitely be a part of the discussion. So. Any other questions? I'll turn it back over to Lauren.
Okay, so I think we can then move on to the school audit report. There are no other questions or comments on the dashboard.
Yes, thank you. So Rob, if you don't mind pulling up the school audit report presentation, it should also be yep, perfect, PDF. Wonderful. So for our audit committee folks and those here are documents in your folder to refer to. We did print off copies of the slides if you'd like to kind of flip back and forth and refer, as well as the full report. So to kick things off, we shared the report with you in its totality on Sunday and hope that you've had the opportunity to review. I hope you'll humor us in this 24 pages. I assure you it's the consolidated version. So, you don't want to see all the, no, maybe you do care about the detail, but we really did our best to take note from feedback we've received from you all to try to keep things high level. In this presentation today, our goal is to do that. So summary of the summary, so to speak. So jumping right in, we're all going to kind of cover a few areas. It's really only 7 slides of content. So if you have questions and you don't want to forget them, feel free to raise your hand. Otherwise, our goal is to knock out the presentation and then we can spend some time discussing. Wonderful. So about our audit approach, jumping right in. So the goal of this project was to develop an audit approach that was focused on learning more about the school level execution of centralized processes. Those centralized processes were focused on financial, operational, and compliance areas. So the other goal of this was to develop school audit engagement, the focus on how do we design this? So in my notes, I bold how, why do we choose the areas we chose, and what did we learn from this? This was also what we explained to the schools that we selected. We said we want to figure out how to do this work, and the takeaways, the audit results, they will be important, and we will share it with the schools, but it's less about what we found and more about how do we do this work and how do we develop something that's sustainable. So in terms of the audit procedures we used, we had a slightly different approach than our typical audit testing, if you will. This involved two new areas that were a bit heavier than usual, being observations. And these terms are defined on page 8 of your report if you're interested. But observations, just as it sounds, we went out to the schools, we looked around, we saw firsthand what goes on there. And then inquiries were a huge piece. So we extensively interviewed the school staff to really help us learn what their lives are like, how these processes function at a school level. And then where applicable, we did go back to the audit testing so we could have some quantitative results. So I'll preface it in saying, I'm sure you saw there's not a lot of quantitative here, but in our communication tools, we are developing this approach of reporting to you all, as I said already, in a very high level summarized way, and then developing these memos. So the memos are going to go to the school principal and their respective leadership with the goal of providing the detail directly to them. Also because some of these things are safety focused and things of that nature, it's in everyone's best interest that we don't highlight every single detail, publicly per se, for the safety of our students. But I will say there was nothing of great concern or alarming. Really things we observed were things that informed the big takeaways you see here. So to jump right to the results, so this is a quick summary of our most notable takeaways. I think the key here also is that these are takeaways that, yes, may apply to these schools we looked at, but ideally, and we believe they apply to all schools. So those takeaways are that we found the folks who sit in our schools who perform our financial and operational processes often have competing priorities. So we saw firsthand as they sit there at the front desk, they have families coming in, they're attending to students' needs, perhaps assisting with helping students get into the building, doing bag checks, the list goes on. And so we have a true appreciation and understanding for why that would be their priority when things like that occur. However, when we get back to the internal audit perspective on things, those controls, those procedures ultimately must still be done and done with consistency. So the next thread here is the need for continuous support from centralized departments to our schools through training and various tools. So one thing we found is that there are really great procedure documents that are developed centrally and distributed to our schools. So they have those up, they know them, they follow them, but it's the step between. So they know how to access the system. For example, they know how to go in and enter time. However, they have all developed these sub procedures outside the system of calendars and check marks and different color codes for who's absent. And so we chose schools that really do have that well developed. And so our mind goes to, what about the person on day one? What about the person with a high turnover in their school? So I think that's really a key takeaway that we've shared. I keep looking to Treasurer's Office because I did the financial aspect of this audit, but in pulling together some best practices to share with our schools. Next would be, as I started to say before, the risks. So the risks of these things are that processes would lag or wouldn't be completed. So it's important for management to consider compensating controls and some of the takeaways and recommendations in this report to combat that. Finally is the risk regarding the decentralized nature of the district. So what we have developed into as a district, a lot of local ownership, which has its pros and cons. And so one of those risks, of course, is when financial processes are done I think of it as like a multi-location audit. Your risk now is spread out because you have a chance that it can be done different ways, different places. So we recommend management consider that in a cost, benefit analysis to see if that format's the best fit, and otherwise maybe centralizing what can be best suited for that. Along the same note, I say all that with this caveat, it has to be a balance. And we acknowledge that some things must be consistent due to compliance matters or what have you. However, all of our schools are unique environments. So that's the kind of the challenge here is finding the balance of flexibility where needed. So that's the quick summary of what we found through our audit, but we will break it down into a little bit more detail to how we arrived at those points. So in terms of our audit criteria, so this project, I think I mentioned at our last meeting, the planning process. So this project included a much more extensive planning process than some of our past audits. We wanted to do a thorough research process to ensure we were selecting the best, most well-suited areas, if you will. So we had meetings with internal audit leaders from other school districts across the country in order to find out how they perform their school audits. They were kind enough to send us all their tools, work plans, what have you. So we were building this big repertoire of ideas. And so we had the same process with our internal folks. So we met with folks centrally as well as at the schools to do the same. What could we audit? So we put all of that together. So we used our professional judgment and whittled it down, coupled it with our past experiences from our other internal audits to say, where do we start? So I'll cover on the next page our objectives, but that's the timeline here and why you see such a significant investment in the planning phase. So I will say we also, had to scope this project. That was a huge undertaking. So in order to test the application of our newly designed audit program, we selected 3 schools of varying specifications. One was a elementary and secondary combined school, and the other 2 were elementary schools. We also chose schools of various sizes because all schools, regardless of their resources, must still fulfill the timekeeping aspects, the financial aspects, what have you. So how does that have an impact on those processes? And it turned out the selection of 3 schools was the perfect fit. You can tell that it kept us plenty busy, and it allowed us to dive a little deeper and really pave the way for our first audit. So moving on to the audit objectives, I certainly won't read all these. I'm sure as you read the report, you got a lot of detail behind them, but I will highlight that it was critical for our team to properly design these audit objectives. We wanted to evaluate as much as we could in the time constraints that we had. And it also need to be concise enough that we can repeat this. Certainly, you'll learn through our next steps. I won't take the thunder, but by evaluating as much as we could in these areas, we can further hone in on, yeah, that was worth it, or maybe we wouldn't, spend the time to do that again. So of course, you can see our financial processes, receiving, time and staffing, safety, security, and then events. So I'll hand it over to to Isaac to cover a little bit more detail about what we did in those areas.
Thank you, Lauren. Yes, I'm going to cover the audit procedures, takeaways, and recommendations that resulted from our work. Next, thank you. So in the interest of time, we won't go into specific detail for every objective, but we wanted to show an example of an objective for how we broke out that single objective into sub-objectives, and then also show what type of audit procedures were performed for each of those sub-objectives. So as Lauren had mentioned, we performed inquiry, observations, and testing for all these sub-objectives. And as I'm sure you saw in the report, a table similar to this one is at the beginning of each objective section in the report. And it kind of breaks that out into what these sub-objectives are and what audit procedures were performed. So in total, we executed 18 sub-objectives from those 5 main objectives. And the report kind of summarizes the procedures for each of those, and then also explains key takeaways for each of those areas, and then the resulting recommendations, if applicable. Next. So moving on to the audit recommendations, for ease of reference, we created this table to summarize all of the audit recommendations that were noted in the report and link them to the objective and area that they came from. So all 8 of these will be incorporated into our status of past recommendations process moving forward. And we vetted all of these recommendations with central office leadership, and they confirmed that each of the recommendations are applicable district-wide. So these aren't necessarily specific to the 3 schools we visited. These were more so high-level takeaways that can be spread throughout the entire district. And we would be happy to kind of go into more detail around any of these. But hopefully they're pretty straightforward with kind of what the recommendation is and kind of where it came from. That's all I've got for the recommendations. I'll turn it over to Emma for next steps.
Yeah, so what are our next steps? I think the first step is saying thank you to the schools that participated. It's not easy talking to auditors. It's scary, and they did an awesome job. We were able to really ask them questions, and they gave us their undivided attention, especially when we're there and there's a million things going on. We were still able to do our job and get what we needed. And also just being at a school, for me personally, I guess I haven't been to school in a while. So learning about like what I'm saying in this part of my job, like what does that mean at the school level? Is it feasible for them to do that, or am I just kind of saying something that they need to do? So really taking that back and thinking, how can we better serve our schools when we come with our recommendations, I think is a learning point that we all made. So with internal audit and management, we are working with management over the recommendations. As Isaac said, those are kind of more centralized and district-wide. They're really trends that we saw or noted at all 3 schools. And again, we looked at 3 out of 69. So we can't really say it's, this huge underlying issue or this huge underlying theme, but it's something between the 3 schools that we noticed. The other thing is the collaboration with schools. What our next step here, we're going to be going to each of the schools and talking with them about what we saw, what our notes are, but also figuring out what we could do better, what maybe we didn't explain, well the first time. But also maybe we looked at things that they thought weren't that important, and they're like, you actually really need to look at this. So figuring out like how we can best make our audit plan going forward with the schools make sense for where the areas that need it the most. And also just prioritizing further collaboration with the schools, whether that looks like us asking all the schools who would want to be audited next. I don't know if anyone would say yes, but maybe there's an area that they need help on or guidance, or a gap that they're not really sure how to fix, and it's something that we can kind of highlight. So this was a huge undertaking and a huge learning experience, but I'm glad we did it. I'm glad we're presenting on it and it's over. But I think that going forward, we have the tools and we have the background, and we kind of have those steps needed to do it quicker and more efficiently, and hopefully just continue doing right by the schools. I think that was, again, a very big learning curve when doing this audit. So that's all we have for next steps. I think our next step would be answering any questions that you guys might have for us.
So I have a question. and the next steps, I know there's sort of a fine line between recommendations and then implementation of best practices. But it seems like that would be a big part of it. A next step would be to have some group within the school district share the best practices. And I'm wondering if that could include like a Zoom meeting of all the people that have the same job at different schools to learn and to commiserate. Would that be part of what you guys are thinking about?
That's exactly where our conversation went. So this is Jen again. So we received these information, I think like a week ago, maybe. And so we've been talking about what those next steps would look like and setting up a team of stakeholders to help define what is best practice and then share it out amongst each other.
Then you're on top of it as always. You're ahead of me.
And I think if I can just add, one thing that I think we'll find is that one practice won't work for a district. I know the phrase system of schools, we use that a lot, right? And so having a couple best practices that different schools can implement will be really useful for them.
Yeah, and that was one of the things when we selected these three schools, they came highly recommended. The people in their roles really knew their stuff because we wanted to go out and learn, tell us the right way to do this or how do you do it? And so I think we saw such a wide variety just among the three schools that were still effective. So when we've talked with the treasurer's office, we're like, what if those folks, we strip out the specifics from their school, but now we have three cool tools people can choose from. So when they go into their job on day one, they have not developed their cool calendar system, but hey, you can download one of these few tools, even match you up with a mentor who's, more seasoned. So that way they feel like they've got someone in a like kind role to look to. And I think that kind of comes from personal experience too. Anyone can read these rules, but go in to do the work yourself, you realize all the nuances.
Of course, I always have questions. So I love this on the three school level. And you and I've already spoken about this, Treasurer Wagner and I, she probably already knows where this is going. But for me, I look at when we get to more complex systems like high schools, and when you're talking about, if you could go back to slide 10 for me, Rob, when you're talking about events that have games or attendance, cash on hand, I see problems. So I'm wondering is there a phase 2 for this where there is when you talk about gate receipts and you're talking about 16 high schools that use hometown, but then also now we have a mandate where we have to also accept cash. How does this fit into working with either outside vending companies like Hometown or PTOs that run the gate or that may run something and accountability there? And I asked that question as having been a PTA person. And there's when you talk about concession funds and food and then kids eat food, I just see there being so much more levels to this. And so I know there's probably a phase 2, 3, 4, 5, and you didn't choose a high school, which I think will add an additional layer. And even when you choose a specific high school like performing arts that has more ticket sales than other high schools, just simply because of the nature of their schooling, how do you foresee the level of complexity being moving forward once you increase to involve more of the system? And then what challenges do you all see from an auditing perspective in dealing with the vendors, or I would just say the extra people, because it could include vendors, it could include our PTOs, and I see this as great, but if we were to just give you 3 different ones, it could change. And so I want to get your feedback, and you also, Jen, and Mike, on and Emma and Isaac, on what do you see? This is great, but I just see it being a little bit more complex. And so is the plan to maybe get this finalized more and then, take 6 months, get this finalized more, and then increase it on a smaller level? And then we talked about the whole system of schools. and dealing with them in a system versus, so I'll give you the question.
Yeah, no, and honestly, that's what we have had on the forefront of our mind from the onset. And the trouble, I think I'll start with the challenge. So just logistically, 69 schools, 3 auditors. Let's say we did like a really stellar job and did 7 audits a year. So we'll get back to you in 10 years once we've audited all the schools. And, it's like, well, that's not really very helpful. So as we talked about this, and we were like, when they asked this question, what is our short answer on that? And truly, I think what we've learned through this is that if we can audit in a way where we can less about the school, we'll give the schools their feedback, but where our takeaways are district focused, that's where hopefully, although we only sampled X, we were able to make an impact on everyone. And so I think there's a lot, though, to be said for segmenting the samples, though. We want to focus a little bit more on high schools next year, let's just say, or whatever the focus could be. And then now you've kind of got this subset or this nuance of takeaways that are maybe most applicable to that group of schools. And we had talked about schools that maybe have a similar education style, like do Montessori's differ from our neighborhood schools? So there's a million ways we could split it. I just think our challenge is, and it kind of speaks to the depth of in which we go into each area. The challenge is the time it takes and the return on that time, and how do we do it most effectively? So the other thing, like when you've talked about the gate receipts and the vendors, and these are all the things that were on the big list, how deep do we go? There is an opportunity for us to say from this work, you know what, through safety and security or from events, let's make that its own audit, where we're going to now look at that as our audit objective. And now we can do a broader and deeper analysis district wide. So there's an opportunity for us to pivot the way we go about the work. But I think to bring it back to the school audit approach, what we learned was that it's not as much about the school. It is, yes, but it's about things we can observe through the sample of schools that help the greater good. Yeah. So it's just that balance that I think we'll learn to strike, but found some traction in this year.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Just to follow up a little bit, do you think you learned enough where you could leverage your learning to just survey all the schools rather than actually go do an audit and let them self-report? You could get lots of data pretty fast.
Yeah, I think we did learn a lot. I do think, though, going to different types of schools, we're going to get different answers, and also talking to different people, we might get a different answer, because there are some schools who are smaller where you're talking to a person and that person is taken all over the school to do all these different jobs that I didn't even know existed. And so I'm like, well, why can't you get your time in? And she's not even at her desk at any point in the day. So I think trying to sit down and sift through all of this information and really figuring out like what are the big areas that these schools need help with. And then if we go back to audit them, how do we bring something that will be valuable to them? And the other thing that we were talking about too is if we do survey the schools, similar to how we send out like a plan to each of the ELT members and say, what areas do you think we might need to look at or you guys need help with? If the schools would be willing to kind of give us more information, and then we look at the list and narrow it down with the risk assessment that we're going to be doing. So like how much for athletics or for, the schools that have all these other ticketed events, maybe that's a big area and it's a riskier area. And so it makes more sense to look at that rather than look at all the, sub areas that we did for these 3 specific schools. I think our job now is to figure out how to do that and the best way to do that, because it seems like there's a few ways that we can go about it. And we just want to make sure that we're adding value to central office, but also at the school level. And we're not really taking up too much time because they do not have it. Go ahead.
And just real quick, I think one thing I want to applaud the work that was done for this, because I think also the other thing that we know is that there are things that were part of other audit recommendations that can be informed by what's happening at the school level. And I think that's one of the things, at least from their team perspective, is and for our committee perspective, is an important asset that can be gained from this. Because again, if we simply say, how come we don't have these cash controls? And then we recognize that we have 13 people who all have never gone through any training whatsoever, being the ones who collect the cash at the school level, that, well, maybe that explains why we don't have certain things. And so that better informs the work that this committee thinks about and looks at. I think of one example that always comes up is it's with regards to who manages the finances on the school level. To that point, if there's a person who's supposed to be doing that, who's supposed to be putting in the payroll and all these other things, and they're not at their desk on a regular amount of time throughout a day, that helps to also explain why we repeatedly saw that as a pattern in those audits. And so I think that's, to me, like, yes, there are some greatness that each school can learn from what's done in each individual audit. But the reality is that some of this is about learning how do the things we talked about on the grand scale work and actually happen in the school, to determine whether or not what we think is important and working matches up to that. Because I think that's, again, one of the struggles, is that each school may have a different challenge to doing certain specific tasks.
So I saw a lot of obvious, the summary of notable trends are very informative. I was curious though, based on the specific objectives you guys lined out, did you see any early indicators of areas that might be more important to look at in the future and focus on?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say maybe I'll speak to the area. Like I looked at the financials and we kind of broke things up. And so when we went out to the schools, we divided and conquered. And so from a financial perspective, I think there's an opportunity, pretty significant opportunity for streamlining the timeliness and the consistency of deposits and the documentation associated with them. And I think that's a huge first step, because if we can get our data more complete and more accurate, now we have something more reliable to audit. Because there were a lot of gaps where you say, I think you probably got the cash on this day, and I think it went into the bank on that day, but due to lack of comprehensive documentation, we can't say with much certainty. And so I would say that would be a huge first step, and like an indicator of we could, that's why we say on our first next step, partnering with management. If we can help the schools get those initial stronger controls in place, then we can do greater analysis. So I don't know in your all's areas if there's any other things you'd highlight.
So I looked at receiving and the time entry pieces specifically. And I think in both those areas, my trend or observation really was just like letting people have the time to do their job. And it's not necessarily because they're having fun and doing whatever in the school. They are really truly getting pulled in a lot of different directions. And so having an hour to solely focus on what they need to do for the day, whether that's receiving on the items that are being shipped out and delivered, or entering time or their absences throughout the school, which also affect if some of these people are busier than others. So I think that was the biggest trend I noticed. And I don't know if there's a right answer on how you might fix that either. So that's a harder one to kind of go down the rabbit hole with.
I think one of the big takeaways that I had shortly after beginning this work was just the vast differences between each of the schools, and we only went to 3. So I can't imagine, the differences throughout all of them. And, we had our expectations going into it around what we thought we would find, or what we thought we were going to observe. And I think a lot of it was really eye-opening. And, we see the central office procedures that they provide, the documents and whatnot. But then once you get out to this school, it's like kind of like the next level. All the other distractions and everything are kind of thrown into it. And so I think from my perspective, it was pretty eye-opening to see all of the different areas that kind of affect very basic procedures, such as keeping track of absences or something, like that. But yeah. And we're accountants. So when I was focusing on safety and security, I had to expand my horizons with that.
Thank you. On the last comment, like all I'll say is, and you guys clearly have a plan to do this, but I personally have never felt like I could audit something without understanding it. And it seems like that's a goal you guys are trying to really encourage your group. So I applaud that. And I think any time you can spend on site and see the reality on the ground is going to be beneficial.
Any other questions or comments around the school audit report? My only comment was I think the idea of getting groups of stakeholders to develop some best practices sounds great, and it is probably exactly what's needed. The first thing that made me think of was, oh, these people are already stretched so thin, and how so as you're thinking through that, just like thinking about their time and like how they continue to perform their daily duties as well as take on this extra role of, being on a committee or, doing these extra meetings. But I honestly think there's really no other way to do it because the people in the schools know what their constraints are and probably have tried a bunch of different things. So I hope that works out and that, that really can help other schools. Next we can move on to the financial discussion, and we're getting a little bit behind on our time, and I want to make sure we have enough time for the executive session. So I think the idea with the financial discussion was just to bring up anything that may have questions or comments that may have arisen from the finance committee meetings. Hopefully everyone's been keeping track of those, and maybe some of the town halls or general board meetings. If anyone has anything, we can probably kind of roll that in with other business unless Jen or Mike or anybody has like specific things they want to present separate from what would have come up in the finance committee. Nope.
No, we
Okay.
don't, we don't have anything. We're just here to answer questions.
Perfect. So does anyone have any questions or comments or things they would like to discuss?
I'll just highlight the one thing that I think is worth note is that the benefits, employee benefits did come and present and did share some of their plans for how to kind of, again, address some of the audit recommendations, but also just trying to be more practical in how they're servicing our benefits plans. And so there was a presentation presented that also included steps towards improving certain areas. I think it's a good note that we also, as part of that discussion, tried to make sure that they're communicating as they go through those steps with the audit team so that they can also be monitoring progress on certain spaces as part of the regular audit process. But I think it was a good opportunity to see, again, one of those areas that came before the budget and finance because of the repeated needs to be addressed from our past audits and the cost that it was hitting our budget for. So this is just a great opportunity to have that discussion.
Yeah, I was encouraged that I didn't totally understand the technical side of it, but that they seem to have addressed the identifier data issue, or at least are starting to address that. I know that was a big challenge in you guys auditing and then performing those follow-up procedures too. So I'm hoping that is a good step. And yeah, I hope that they're getting some feedback maybe from your group to make sure like that what they're doing is going to work for you. I don't know if you've had any meetings with them yet.
Yeah, I haven't had any additional, I haven't had them reach out to me much since the March 15th Finance Committee meeting. I think they've gone through though and updated their status of past recommendations. So our thing that will continue to drive home, especially as we kind of move into this planning phase as we approach the June 26th meeting, is our mechanism now for what projects can be continuously audited And conversely, how do we ensure people who reported the status of their past recommendations are complete? Well, you got to complete them there and then they move into continuous auditing. And so I said that kind of backwards. So we must have them report the recommendation is complete. Then we can provide the reassurance to ourselves, to the audit committee that those and to management that those things are working. So we're kind of anxiously on the edges of our seat for each of those recommendations to roll into the completed phase. So we can begin testing in that fashion again. So I think that's kind of the structure we've built with them and everyone else as well. But leading back a few months, I think Emma's met with their new benefits analyst and went through some of our specific data trends that we saw through the audit. So, we're always excited and willing to impart our things that we learned through our audits so that can better equip their team.
Anybody else? Anything? The only other thing, I was pleased to see the QI AP team presentation. It really seems like that the work that they're doing is really feeding into some of the recommendations and that they're taking kind of a bigger picture view and really trying to improve their processes rather than just like, okay, we got to check this box to make the auditors happy. So I thought they seemed to be doing some really great work there. I was happy to see that. And I think too, I like the that a lot of the things that you tested in the school audits really feed back into the other, audits that we've done and the recommendations that were maybe still open and addressing some of those core issues, specifically with AP and the receiving. It seems like that's a big issue. A big part of it is at the schools. And so it's nice to see that the root cause being addressed instead of just like screaming at people and telling them they're doing it wrong.
Yeah, I think if I may, like one of the tools using QI is the 5 why tool, right? And so it's a great example. Why can't we pay this invoice? Well, receiving wasn't done. Why? Well, someone at the school didn't do it. And so now you're getting into why is that person at school not doing receiving? Well, it's because they're, chasing kids around. It's because they're, helping with bag checks. It's because they're all the things that Emma and Lauren talked about. So.
And if I could just add to that, thank you, Liz, for pointing that out, because we have actually 9 quality process improvement teams going right now, and we're going to be highlighting a different one at each of the finance committee meetings. Some are further along in their process. It's taking a while to get enough people trained on the QI process improvement tools to get a lot of fast progress. So it's been good, but we're really starting to see some really cool things happen. So stay tuned.
Yeah, and I think it's really wonderful through the finance committee and now audit committee and the management teams and our team that we're creating this cycle of showing how all this work comes together. And I think the QI project presentations are wonderful because they highlight that. And then we can also trace them back. So I know one of the consistent pieces of feedback we've gotten is ROI on the internal audit recommendations. And I think collectively through this joint effort, you can measure that data as you go. And that's really what I believe you use to inform your next decisions about what, interventions work and what we stick with or what doesn't. And how do we measure that?
Yeah, I mean, sure. That's the key part of it is, trying interventions, measuring their effectiveness, and then choosing where to go. I mean, I think really for a lot of the QI projects, there's definitely a sweet spot where there's an audit recommendation that ties into how we're feeling about the process. It ties into the financial data. And when all those things come together, which is what happened in AP, it makes a really nice, tight project to work on.
Well, great work, everyone. So other business, I think this is just any final questions or comments that anyone has. And if not, then I think we can adjourn to our executive session. I don't have anything. Anybody? Anything?
We need a motion.
Uh,
Just ask.
okay. Jim makes a motion to what, we motioning to adjourn into executive session?
For-
Thank you.
For reason,
For
employment of a.
employment of a public employee or official. And,
The motion was made by Jim.
okay.
I'll second. Okay,
Oh,
seconded by
thank you
Paul.
all. Thank you all.
Okay, we're in an exec session.
All right.
Oh, wait, all in favor?
Yeah.
The vote. Voice vote.
All in favor? Thank you.
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Any opposed? Thank you.